Hello and welcome to the Private Capital Podcast. I'm Joe Riley, head of Circulus Group, a network for family offices based in Greenwich, Connecticut. There's a vast landscape of valuable but unconventional assets out there. But how do you find them, filter them, and properly value them? What frameworks can you use to understand them, and how can you integrate them into a portfolio? Jeff Collins of Cloverlay, a seasoned investor in niche assets for decades, loves to explore these esoteric and overlooked opportunities. We delve into various topics, including litigation finance, the intellectual property behind the Care Bears, refurbishing cargo planes, purchasing whiskey barrels, and modeling the future revenues for the Phantom of the Opera. Jeff shares his insights on how he selects these assets, mobilizes the capital to catalyze their growth, and defines their exit strategy. Cloverlay is located in Pennsylvania and currently manages about $2 billion. As the managing partner, Jeff Collins oversees the firm's investment strategy and serves on its investment committee. Jeff founded Cloverlay after a successful career at Morgan Stanley, where he was a managing director in the Alternatives Investment Partners Group. In that role, he was a key member of the Private Markets Investment Committee, responsible for leading complex investments in special situations and buyouts around the world. His background also includes private equity investing at Petra Capital Partners and investment banking at Robertson Stephens. He holds an M.B.A. from the Wharton School and a bachelor's degree in politics from Princeton University. Please enjoy my conversation with Jeff Collins.
This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Anything said by the guests or host should not be construed as legal or investment advice. Thanks for listening.
Maybe you could tell us how Princeton politics major ended up interested in these offbeat assets.
It wasn't a direct path, to be sure. I was dragged by the hair through all of my economics and finance classes by my genius roommates, Fred and John, one of whom is a microeconomics professor at Northwestern now, and the other one trades equity derivatives in New York. And as we approached the end of college, I thought about the experience post-college that would provide me with the broadest exposure and the widest launch pad I could secure instead of being stuck into a hole at the ripe old age of 22. And that took me to the management consulting interview process and investment banking interview process, because the friends that had gone on before me had talked about that 2-year training ground, both from a technical standpoint, a network standpoint, and then also just awareness of parts of the world of business, whether it's finance or other, that you just don't know about when you're in college and you never find out about talking to your parents or your friends. So I primarily pursued those two paths and ended up going down the investment banking route, even though the politics background was basically irrelevant. It led me to be a proficient writer, I think, which has come in handy over the years, especially now. But the politics was and remains my passion, but it was not necessarily relevant.
Did you work on campaigns? Did you work on the Hill?
I worked on the Hill for a summer during college for a senator from South Carolina. And I grew up in Georgia. My dad lived in South Carolina. And that was an interesting experience, but it wasn't really work, honestly. It was a very large intern program. It was more of a tour of Washington, D.C. and every department of the government. And it was very interesting, but it was also very apparent to me that it's hard to remain your own person. You get pulled in different directions, and it's hard to figure out who in Washington doesn't owe other people a lot of favors. And that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. It's hard to be independent. It's hard to maybe change your mind. You're held responsible for everything you do as soon as anybody knows your name in Washington, D.C. So it was a fascinating experience. I valued it, and I was very happy that I was able to do it, but it didn't leave a lasting impression on me in terms of this is the place I must live and this is the business I want to be in.
You started looking at unique assets when you were at Morgan Stanley. Why was Morgan Stanley interested in those assets? And I'd actually be very curious as to how much of an appetite do these big firms have for these kind of hairy situations?
I think Morgan Stanley was unique among its competitors at the higher end of the bulge bracket in terms of investment management. in that they had effectively acquired through a joint venture the pension investment team from the Weyerhaeuser Corporation. And so some of your older listeners may remember Weyerhaeuser as a Fortune 150 company with 70,000 employees and the largest timber owner in the world. And then all of these other businesses, like diaper business, containerboard business, everything that is related to trees. It was a monster. The pension team began innovating in 1985 in a very quiet way. And they invested 100% of the cash assets of the pension fund in alternatives. And so they got their equity and fixed income exposure through these things called equity or derivative overlays. And they took all of the cash assets and they chased off. And what that meant on the hedge fund side initially was stat arb. And then that industry evolved fairly dramatically. And on the private side, it meant unique assets wherever they sit in the world. Roll forward to 2000, Morgan Stanley and the Weyerhaeuser Corporate Pension Fund created a group inside of Morgan Stanley Investment Management called Alternative Investment Partners. And it's still alive and vibrant and diagonally across the street from me. So in the 2000s, you had commercial real estate in Japan, distressed, non-performing loan pools in Japan. That was an innovative asset. Consumer in Korea. Then during the financial crisis, two specific jurisdictions, Portugal and the UK, in the US, in Europe, and some opportunities in the US. So non-performing loan pools was one. There were a lot of investors in aviation. It's become an asset class unto itself. Our approach to aviation was to convert wide body passenger configuration airplanes into cargo planes in 2003, 2004. A lot of people forget about SARS, which halted trans-Pacific traffic. 50% at the time, 50% of global cargo capacity was in the belly of those planes that stopped flying. So you had the exact same airframe type between passenger and cargo, passenger market going straight down, cargo market going straight up and to the right because I can't get my stuff from China fast enough. Same airframe type. So we found a partner who had secured over 50% of the global conversion capacity for 3 years. That's an unfair advantage in a little niche that technically lies inside of aviation, but no one else was doing that. So that's on the tangible side, a lot of what we did. We spent a lot of time in litigation finance, but didn't do anything. Spent a lot of time in intellectual property and did some things, pharmaceutical royalties, music publishing rights, and things like that. The market for Cloverlay style investing really was the reason for me to leave and set up the firm, in that there are more and more of these asset types that are now actionable for our kind of capital. And the reasons vary, but I think it's mostly a sophistication or evolution of broader financial markets, the availability of capital, and how much capital has come into traditional strategies and traditional businesses. If you own a senior living facility, you know that there are 20 private equity buyers for your asset. If you own a dry cleaner, you know that there are people that are rolling up dry cleaners. If you're an RIA, there are lots of people rolling up RIAs. If you own the intellectual property to the Care Bears, but you don't actually make any t-shirts or backpacks, you just own the intangible asset, what's the market for that? It's a very different competitive dynamic. It's much, much more difficult to understand, and therefore a better place for us to focus and invest capital in an uncorrelated and we think interesting way.
Just out of curiosity, what was the outcome of the Weyerhaeuser strategy? Do you know?
It was outrageous performance and just perpetuated the program inside of Morgan Stanley Investment Management, and then obviously grew it far beyond Weyerhaeuser. But they were very strong performers. It was led by a gentleman named Jack Coates, who was the CIO at Weyerhaeuser and then the head of the business at Morgan Stanley. He's an investor with us now. And then the co-founder was the head of private equity at Weyerhaeuser, co-founder of Morgan Stanley, became the head of Morgan Stanley, and now our senior advisor, Corey Polfrey, my mentor. So it's great to have that scar tissue, all the learnings, all the successes, to have that around the table at Cloverlay is invaluable to us.
I think it was good because they had first mover advantage. There's a lot of folks who did, for example, they did very well in hedge funds and venture simply because they were there early for Sequoia. They were there early in hedge funds in the late 80s.
I think part of it is first mover advantage, but there were certainly some examples of successes where they were just looking where others didn't into episodic very interesting esoteric private assets that maybe never came to grow to be $100 billion opportunity. It was just a point in time. This is an interesting thing that we can do something with and make a very interesting risk-adjusted return in an uncorrelated way for our pensioners, or at Morgan Stanley for our institutional and high net worth investors, where it doesn't need to be a growth thesis. It can be a repositioning thesis where you can make 2.5 times money in a very replicable, reliable way, but you can't deploy $1 billion into that opportunity.
Do they fit comfortably within these firms, the Morgan Stanleys, the Goldmans of the world? I think the analogy of pharma is that pharma doesn't want to do the R&D. They want
Right.
somebody else to do it. And it doesn't make sense for Morgan Stanley to try to figure out, say, IP for songs, but it certainly makes sense to do that independently.
Yeah, I think the largest investment banks that own very large investment management operations are in the business of scale. And whatever idea, whatever fund you raise, whatever strategy you raise, it needs to be able to get very large over time. And that comment would apply to the collection of niches where we invest, but not to any one or two or handful. And so thankfully, there was a home for this operation inside of Morgan Stanley at a point in time. But when it was never going to be a $20 billion investment management business, it was not necessarily de-emphasized. It's just the firm will chase scalable opportunities and support those, which is the reason that an independent firm like Cloverlay should exist to perpetuate this program at the right size, on the right sort of pacing, and do it at the right way without the pressure of saying, I need to be $20 billion in 5 years, otherwise I've failed. We don't feel that pressure at all. We're in the business of generating returns for our investors that are complementary to what else they might be doing in traditional private markets.
So how did the firm start? What was that first year like? What were the first investors?
First year, following my 1 year non-compete, non-solicit, where couldn't own a management company in a quote competing business, and I couldn't talk to current or potential Morgan Stanley clients, which I think means everyone. So the only thing I could do was talk to friends who had started firms and been successful doing so. And organizational design was the emphasis for the first year, subletting office space from a friend out here on the main line in Philadelphia, and trying to get smart. And one of the huge benefits of our business at Morgan Stanley and my daily existence at Morgan Stanley was having seen through deep dive diligence thousands and thousands of different GPs, different management companies, different organizations, how they'd grown successful, what the growing pains were, seeing the startups, seeing the masters of the universe and everything in between. So we had a really nice running head start. And the conversations with friends who had started firms led to our initial investor base. Called friends and said, what should my CFO look like day one versus year 5? What's the right sales model? How do you evolve a partnership instead of just retaining ownership with the founders forever and ever, and your junior partners are frustrated at some point? And the number of those conversations with people that I've known very well, professionally and personally, that ended with them saying, I've known you for a long time. Maybe we've invested together, maybe we worked together, whatever it was. I trust you. I understand what you're doing, and I personally have no exposure to this. Can I be involved? Ended up being an interesting number. And so the managing partners of a lot of traditional private equity funds that your listeners will know are personal investors with us. Our first separate account client is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur billionaire that we have known for years and years. And we were 100% of his private exposure because he has equity beta covered, thank you very much, through the main event. And he said, give me the uncorrelated, long-dated private assets. So we have a $200 million separate account from him. And then from there, the initially large corporate pension from the US was our Fund 1 anchor, and then a number of family offices of medium size. I would say the 350 to 1.5 billion, not the ones that have a staff of 20 people, but the mid-size, very sophisticated. They have their buyout relationships. They have their venture relationships. They have their real estate relationships, probably direct, but they don't own any of the assets that we invest in. It's hard to raise money with a PowerPoint and 5 employees and an idea with no track record that you can claim.
Was there a chicken and egg problem? Obviously, there's a lot of long runway. Did you have issues that first year securing investments?
Not really issues, but because of our smaller size at the time, you roll forward 10 years, where this summer we will be 2 billion. So our per deal investment size and the control implied in our second 5 years is very different than our first 5 years. And so initially, deals were not an issue, but our role, because of our size, was different than it is today. And so there are far more examples in our earliest days where we couldn't by ourselves galvanize a situation because our check size simply wasn't large enough. If we were just with separate account alpha, we were an $8 million investment. So we're not the only ones there. Roll forward to today, we can galvanize a situation, be the only ones involved. And that leads to governance, it leads to disclosure, it leads to timeline, all of the advantages that you would want by being the right size instead of being small at the beginning. Clearly has impacted not only the kinds of deals that we do and our relationship with our operating partner or CEO on the ground, but it also influences the end result, honestly, being more in control as opposed to being a minority owner in a very interesting asset. We now drive the bus.
I assume there's often some give up in liquidity with these assets. How do you think about what you have to give up versus the higher return?
Exit path is a critical component. It's the second discussion item when we start reviewing opportunities in our pipeline. The first discussion point is dimensioning our downside. So keep in mind, we say we're buying these esoteric, niche, uncorrelated assets. And when we say assets, we mean assets, tangible or intangible, not operating businesses. There are no public comps. There is no EBITDA. These are things. Sometimes you can touch them, sometimes you can't. And we're doing so on an unlevered basis. So discussion point number one is, if the world ends, if we get everything right, what is our recovery? If we're buying an asset with no debt, is it a cacao plantation that you can sell for 80 cents on the dollar as cattle land? Or is there more downside? Because we're creating these assets or creating our entry point below intrinsic or replacement value. We are value investors first and foremost. And so we look around and say, if the world ends, this cannot be a binary outcome. There has to be a recovery. The second discussion point is exit path, because they are unique assets. And the exit path will vary by asset type and asset category. There are some, particularly in the tangible world, where once we have succeeded in creating a coherent portfolio of scale, for example, in industrial outdoor storage, there are buyers for a large portfolio that we have assembled. And iOS is interesting. Industrial outdoor storage, they are the strangely shaped gravel parking lots surrounded by a chain link fence in every municipality in the US and Europe, where the proverbial Verizon repair truck has to park every night forever and ever because we're beside the highways and we're beside the bridges. There are no institutional owners, yet there are tens of thousands of $4 million iOS properties in the United States. So our thesis was, this is industrial real estate that is completely absent from industrial private equity real estate portfolios. But if we create a coherent portfolio of scale, there are a number of buyers with their hands in the air. This should be a category of REIT. It's just not, because it hasn't been consolidated yet. So we did that in the US 5 years ago. I'd say the industry is in the fourth inning. I think we got it in the second inning. We replicated the strategy in the UK, specifically around Heathrow Airport, with a different partner. I think the UK is still in the first inning. So on the tangible side, thinking about exit path, sometimes it's selling on to known buyers. There are other asset types, particularly in intellectual property. You have two different return profiles or exit paths. There are some in intellectual property where we just naturally make our return and then disappear. There is no sale. It's actually a really additive component to an uncorrelated portfolio. I don't need the S&P to be doing anything when I sell. I will have made my return and then naturally go to zero. There are others in intellectual property where there is an exit with a defined universe of potential buyers, but that universe tends to change. So we invested in Broadway theatrical rights. So we are not putting shows on Broadway or the West End, but we are taking Phantom of the Opera to Singapore on an actuarial basis in terms of how frequently you come back to Singapore with a guaranteed box office. So we take no box office risk. We receive a check before the set is sent on a boat. You're building these long-term, durable royalties based on the intellectual property of iconic titles. And when you want to see Annie in Dallas, that's us. And we know that you'll see it every 3 years and we'll be there for 30 days. So it's that sort of program. Who is that saleable to? What's interesting about that niche is the owner of touring companies that own or lease forever the intellectual property of the shows. It's like some other industries, the aggregators, the monsters in the space have changed behavior over time. And so at one point, the theaters owned much of the content that came through their theater. And then the theaters retreated to their core activity, which is, I am just a theater. I'm not an owner of intellectual property. Sell all the other stuff and I will be a REIT. Now you're seeing theaters starting to come back and say, I have to control my intellectual property coming through my theater again. And so the exit path on that one is a combination of, once it's at scale, it could be a royalty buyer. It could be a very large family office, even a sovereign. It could be a larger strategic participant in the broader industry of anything live events because they don't own anything related to Broadway. There's no institutional capital in that space at all. Or if it gets large enough and someone had growth plans to go beyond theater, there are a lot of production companies, staging companies. It's another theme in traditional private equity. And none of them own the intellectual property and they don't do staging for theater. But theater is a large global business, but it's not $1 billion opportunity. It's a $200 million opportunity. So we always think about exit at the front end.
We could talk a little bit about how you source and structure these assets. What does the top of the funnel look like? I'd imagine your competitive advantage to a large extent is your ability to filter these particular assets.
The top of the funnel is never large enough, but it's quite large. The reason it's large, I think, is partially reputational. We as a firm, we as individuals at Cloverlay have been a known audience for the niche and the weird for decades. And so when there is an opportunity in the largest coin collection in the world, we're going to see that and we want to see all of it. Now, the second layer of the funnel tightens up a lot because the initial is a lot of low-grade ore. But we want to see all of it because we'll learn something from any conversation in any of these off-the-run asset types. But the sourcing, the way we talk about sourcing really is through 3 channels. There is a placement agent ecosystem around some of the assets that we care about. It's usually 1 and 2 person shops that are attempting the hard road of raising a $75 million fund, doing something that is ostensibly on mandate for us. Maybe they're raising 1 or 2 deals a year. We want to see all of it. We think we see almost all of it because we've been doing this for so long, but very low hit rate in that world. And it's not the name brands that your listeners will have heard of. It's truly 1 and 2 person shops. The second sourcing channel are the participants inside each of the asset categories where we have spent significant time and built network nodes. We receive deals from operators in a space because we've spoken with them in the past. We've proactively remained in touch with them, and we will receive from a friend in the litigation finance segment where we operate in the corners, not in the middle of the fairway where most people have seen it. We will receive the unpolished first version of the pitch book that was attempting to consolidate all of the Dieselgate claims in Germany, where there's no such thing as a class action lawsuit, only because of network nodes. I did not find that while kicking the bushes in Germany. It was because We've been talking about litigation finance with someone who only participates in that space, and they speak German and they live in Berlin. So the participants in the space are the second sourcing channel. And then the third are, I was talking earlier about early days Cloverlay check size versus current investment size. And the third channel is our investor brethren, people that we compare notes with on a regular basis, where two of us can make a situation happen. We're extremely collaborative. We're an open book. We talk about our pipeline to the extent there is, if it's not a capacity constrained situation, we actively talk about it because there are people that are very familiar with some of the asset types that we're interested in, potentially more familiar than we are because they only focus on two of them. And we want to benefit from their knowledge and potentially their participation. And so going back to litigation finance, we're either the first or the second institutional investor into the law firm industry in the United States. So how large is the law firm industry in the United States? Is it $500 billion? I don't know what it is, but until 2 years ago, there were zero institutional dollars allowed to participate directly in the economics of a law firm. Then there was a regulatory change in Arizona, and we in a Midwestern endowment that we compare notes with all the time, the two of us were the first or second participant in that space and at a size where we were able to act. And so there was collaboration between the two of us over a period of many years where we were zeroing in on the same opportunity and sharing what we wanted it to look like. And then we were able to find that profile and act on it very swiftly, going back to the first mover advantage.
We could take a specific example, maybe Care Bears. So maybe we could talk about how you found it, when you decided, and what made you decide to pull the trigger, and then maybe how you structured it.
Sure. It's an interesting example because we divide the intellectual property world into two camps. One is mechanical, so the things inside your iPhone that are long-term, durable licensing agreements, technology that you're not actually making it, but someone is using your technology to make a device work. Then we've been active there. The other part of intellectual property is content. And we had been spending a lot of time in content of different types, with a going in thesis in one part of content around long dated, extremely well-known, but undermanaged brands. What's a name that everyone knows who's under the age of 60, but you're not really sure why you know it because it's not a $1 billion enterprise. It's just an iconic piece of content that maybe hasn't been managed by Warner Brothers for the last 20 years. And we had looked at a number of opportunities that did not end up coming to fruition inside the intellectual property content space. And we've been talking to a number of potential CEOs or operating partners in the space as they were looking for different kinds of assets. And some of them were not interesting to us, but we had ongoing conversations with a number of them who were looking for something that kind of rhymed with our going in thesis. And what ended up happening was, again, network nodes. We heard from one of them that the Care Bears might be for sale. And then nothing ever happened. A separate conversation where we got very close with an operating partner on a different collection of assets. They suddenly said, we are dropping that because we can close on the Care Bears in 45 or 60 days. We know everything about the asset. We know the team incredibly well. And the seller has said, we will not sell to Mattel or Hasbro or Warner Brothers because we like our team and we want to perpetuate our team. And we know that if we sell to one of the big guys, the team will go away. So an extremely unique sourcing story because it came from a couple of different angles with the backdrop of us looking for something that kind of is what the Care Bears ended up being. And then having the long-term relationship with the right operating partner who had the closest relationship with the seller of the assets in a unique seller dynamic, there was no process. There was no banker. It was, I am selling to someone that I know at a fair price. And it was a family office as I get my affairs in order. And this is the third to last asset that I'm selling. So I'm a little bit maybe less focused on it. The Care Bears from that point forward has performed extraordinarily well. And that global licensing and royalty stream has grown significantly. And our operating partners done an amazing job. The management team that had been in place has done an amazing job. And we're happy to be the majority owner of it. And we think we're in it with one family office from the Boston area that a lot of your listeners would know. And it's been a really interesting road in terms of taking this iconic brand and expanding its presence globally. And we have 4-hour-long board meetings shaking our fists about Hello Kitty. That's a real thing in my job, which is funny. Hello Kitty's dominant. They're amazing. But it's those kinds of assets that keep us coming to work every day and smiling and thinking about how interesting the things are that we look at and how lucky we are to be doing this.
Yeah, but where in the process did you decide that this was going to be a good investment? And how did you think about structuring it? Because I guess the question with all of these things, and this certainly comes up a lot now, that Spotify has brought new life into music, for example.
Yep.
Because 10 years ago, and 20 years ago, we looked at music catalogs. But how do you model long-term demand? How do you have any idea that, and to your other example before, how do I know that Phantom of the Opera, obviously very persistent, but do I really know that in 10 years or 20 years, that will still be relevant? And does that matter to your calculations today?
Yeah, I think there's actually a parallel between the Broadway touring IP and the Care Bears IP in that the intellectual property has existed for so long that the baseline performance is very predictable. The question becomes, at what price? And can we do anything to improve that? Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes it would be trying to reignite a brand as if it were new because you bought it so well. But the reason you bought it so is that no one knows the brand. But in the case of the Care Bears, it's an anomaly in so many different ways. If your listeners know about the Care Bears or their kids have Care Bears t-shirts, that's based on episodes that ran on CBS in 1981. There's no Care Bears movie. They haven't been on TV for 35 years. It's solely based on the quality of the intellectual property and how it resounds with the Western public. And so we looked at that as an incredibly predictable and durable royalty stream as a baseline. Now, what would happen if there were a movie? What would happen if you went to Asia and Latin America and methodically rolled out a truly global institutional quality licensing and royalty program? And we have reaped the benefits of doing exactly that, but betting only on the baseline. We were going to make our return based on just the normal world, but we were able to grow a royalty stream, which is different than being a financial buyer of a royalty stream, which you see so frequently in music publishing rights, which you brought up, which is I can see the Spotify data and I think my price is good and I'll use 75% LTV debt and I think I'm going to make a levered 11 or 12% return. This is a very different situation where you can actually grow the royalty streams through blocking and tackling and having an operating partner who's never done anything other than that. So the parallel between Broadway and Care Bears, I think, holds pretty strongly just because of the quality of the baseline asset. It's not going away. People are not going to stop seeing Cats. So what else can you do with the same IP? Can you grow that without creating any additional risk to the platform? From a structure, this is probably not the greatest example because we're just majority equity control. So we're the outright owners of the intellectual property. So structuring there was very straightforward. We have other investments where structure is more on the intellectual property side, on the mechanical intellectual property side. There's some situations where our structure is in partnership with a technology company that has a very large portfolio of intellectual property, individual patents, and we will create an SPV. The company drops all of their intellectual property into the SPV. We contribute the investment dollars, and then we and our operating partner assist them in monetizing the value of their IP. We are not investing in their company. The company can thrive or fail. We're investing in the intellectual property of that technology company and bringing in the people to monetize through licensing and royalties. monetize the assets that maybe haven't been exploited because the company is focused on making a widget or creating software or whatever the case may be, but they own valuable assets. They might not realize it, or they might not be equipped or staffed or funded enough to actually maximize the value of the intellectual property away from their core business. So we always try to be non-core. We try to be a solution for the assets that are non-core to the current owners.
What's the exit in that regard?
It's usually, I shouldn't even say usually, because we've seen and participated in structures across the board. Sometimes those are the self-liquidating style, where once we meet our predetermined return on both a multiple and IRR basis, they own all of their intellectual property again. So that's almost a bridge to event. That you need capital to do your thing. We will provide that capital. We don't care about your thing. We care about your intellectual property, and we will generate value from the intellectual property away from your business. And then when we make 2.2 times or 2.7 times or whatever the case may be, you own all of your IP again. There are other structures where maybe the company isn't really a going concern and the only thing they own is their intellectual property. Then we'll come in and the exit is a sale of the royalty streams that we've created through the licensing agreements to a royalty buyer. So you'll find it's all situational, but we have the flexibility and the creativity and the experience to structure appropriately for each situation so that we are insulated from all of the sort of systematic risk and create that. We're never trying to make 5 times money. This is not venture investing or we will underperform your greatest buyout fund. A very predictable, very uncorrelated march to 2.5 times money. That's the point. And so structuring can help get you there, but structuring in and of itself frequently, especially in today's private credit world, we hear people talking about structuring and how it's a bulletproof return. At the end of the day, it's credit risk, and credit risk can be volatile over time. We don't take credit risk. That's not uncorrelated. So we'll look for the assets that rely on, nothing is completely uncorrelated, but we'll look for the assets that are insulated from what might be happening in the world. Like our largest investor, the state pension plan, called in the middle of the tariffs and said, Jeff and Kendra, can you please polish up your crystal ball and tell us the impact of tariffs on our existing portfolio and also how it's impacted how you're thinking about your pipeline?
Which ones were impacted by tariff?
We have a whiskey platform, premium Scotch whiskey called Compass Box. And we hope everyone buys Compass Box. It's an amazing product. The reason we invested in Compass Box is that we bought 6 million liters of liquid inventory made specifically for us from our former production partner on 2-year stale pricing. That's the tangible asset. That's why we're in Compass Box. So the optionality piece of the uncorrelated private trade that we did in liquids, that's impacted by tariffs because the US is our largest market and Scotch whiskey has to be made in Scotland. So the reality is that the bottles being sold in the US are impacted, but the reason we're in it is the asset coverage that we purchased that's more than doubled in value since we've been involved. So that it's we hope we sell bottles, we hope tariffs go away, but we like the appreciating value of our 6 million liters of liquid inventory.
So you've been in the unique position of seeing the entire life cycle of one of these assets, which is litigation finance. You were there in the early days. You folks got your head around it. You were investors, and now you've seen it mature to some extent and have exited the space. I'd be very curious into what your experience was like.
Sure. We started in 2000, probably 7 or 8. Was the first time we seriously did work in litigation finance. And it was the earliest days and it was focused on complex commercial cases. And at the time, there was virtually no private capital involved in the space. It was imminently actionable. And complex commercial is where a small guy sues big guy for infringement of trademark. That's a hypothetical example. Hey, Coca-Cola, your new iced tea looks shockingly similar to my iced tea, and so I'll sue you. And Coca-Cola can starve the little guy and litigate forever, right? Or play defense forever. Until private capital comes in and says, I am backing the little guy against Coca-Cola or whoever it may be. And all of a sudden, the settlement dynamic and the value of that case changes dramatically because the claimant is no longer capital starved. That attracted a tremendous amount of capital very quickly. And the pendulum of power in litigation finance swung from the initial days of one of the few providers of capital. I'm going to visit a law firm and I would like to look at your entire caseload and I'll let you know which 5 I care about. In not very much time, there were so many providers of capital that litigation finance started looking a lot like mezzanine debt sitting on top of the entire caseload of every law firm in the United States. That's very different than the earliest innings. The primary problem with litigation finance has been duration of cases. And you can't blame it solely on COVID because even the most conservative estimates of time to resolution pre-COVID were wrong on the short end. Then COVID, the court system really slowed down and truly hasn't picked up to its pre-COVID pacing. And so there are a lot of highly valuable cases that have just taken forever to reach resolution. And the way we stepped back into litigation finance after not being around it at all was to participate in direct secondaries of individual cases, not private equity secondaries, buying an LP interest in some fund. Going back to the earliest days, going into litigation finance funds who have distributed no capital to their LPs and they're trying to raise fund 3 and looking at their caseload and saying, I will take those 6. That's a pretty interesting innovation that hadn't existed in litigation finance. And then the second innovation was obviously the regulatory change in Arizona that I spoke about earlier, where it's like sports. It's how large are the big 4 American sports? Until 5 years ago, when we invested in the middle of the first winter of COVID, there were 0 institutional dollars in big 4 sports in North America. Roll forward to today, your listeners can and should probably invest in an NFL fund. Our job was to do it in 2020 when people weren't aware that it was actionable. So it's back to the first mover advantage, I think, and pre-institutional, having a situation surrounded, understanding the rules, understanding our role, and deciding whether it's actionable for our kind of capital. And the answer in sports was yes. The answer in litigation finance direct secondaries was yes. And the answer in the ownership of the economics of law firms was yes.
Could you give an example of an asset that was particularly intriguing, but that you ultimately passed on?
There are a lot. I mentioned the largest coin collection in the world. We looked at the largest classic car collection in the world. It's $250 million or something like that. It's where we've spent a tremendous amount of time, but can't find the right entry point. Has been trying to think how to frame it the right way. Art in the broadest definition of art. So if you think about fine wine, if you think about the most expensive whiskey in the world, or you think about a Degas, those are totally unique markets and there's no institutional capital in them. Where we've fallen down on the art side, as opposed to the sort of tangible liquid side, I guess painting is liquid, but the value of the painting is intangible. That's where we've always had the shortcoming, the actuarial sort of analysis behind what is the value of this piece of art. And if you create stratifications of art and say, okay, you have your $80 million pieces, and then you have your $20 to $30 million pieces, and you have your $1 million pieces, what's the most appropriate entry point for our capital based on our objectives and also our experience base? We haven't been able to get there. It's an asset class that could play a role, but it remains too qualitative. We can't predict what happens because it's not just inflation plus growth, even though if you look at the entire art world, it has been. But you don't own the entire art world, you own a number of pieces. So how do you value a piece of art? So that's the one where we spent a lot of time, but just haven't been able to get over the hump. We've looked at electric vehicle charging and other infrastructure, not the vehicles themselves, but what is the evolution of self-driving cars? What does that mean? What needs to be created and owned by someone to support that ecosystem that I think everyone believes is coming? That's chargers and where, not sure. Will your self-driving Uber drive 50 miles to park where it's cheap, or will your self-driving Uber park somewhere near your house? Those are really different equations. If you get it wrong, you're really wrong. Not a business we're in. Self-driving cars also rely, and we come up with lots of fun facts, or at least facts that we think are fun. We've been investors in 4 different wireless spectrum auctions in the United States. So we own the real estate in the sky in different zip codes around the United States, and we own different bands, and different bands of spectrum play different roles. Some bands travel really well over long distances and they penetrate buildings, but they don't carry much data. So there's a use case for that band. There are other bands that carry all of the data, but they only travel 100 yards. There's a use case for that. That's the band that is required for autonomous cars. Who's going to put up a pole every 100 yards in the United States? But we're thinking about those long-term questions and the individual assets that will underpin that absolutely massive industry and how to potentially be involved at the right point in time. Not speculative, not from a venture basis, but saying, when the pole, who owns the poles? Does Verizon own the poles? Does the municipality own the poles? Does a privately held company own the poles? We don't know. Who owns the equipment hanging on the poles? Like, that sounds like cell phone towers, but much, much cheaper, but far more of them. So there are parallels to industries that we've had great success in, but trying to think about how the world could evolve does play a role for sure.
I guess the parallels will probably be with, I know you folks did a lot in dark fiber. So were the parallels you saw in that industry, why were they compelling versus something like millimeter wave?
Yeah, dark fiber is great. And hopefully it comes across that everything we look at is different. And there's a backstory to every single one. Dark fiber is interesting. So we invested in data centers about 10 years ago. So it's like the sports example. Our job is to get in front of an asset intensive segment in the right way before that $4 billion presentation hits your listeners' desks. Like, we're done with data centers now. We're selling or have sold all of our data centers. But as we had been in and around sort of data infrastructure world, what we noticed was, in addition to the large REITs and the largest strategics building different kinds of cold boxes in different parts of the world, there was not a lot of attention paid to a relatively new but critical component, which is the interconnectivity between the data centers. Everyone was focused on the big box with a Google contract attached to it. But all of the data centers have to speak to each other, and they have to speak to each other in a very specific way. Fiber is a unique asset. It is buried in the ground, and there are 2 different kinds of fiber. One is lit fiber, one is dark fiber. The lit fiber, the analogy I use, and Kendra gets mad at me because she knows way more about this than I do. But lit fiber is when you drive to the airport, if you leave at 5 a.m., you can get there in 22 minutes. And if you leave at 9 a.m., it takes you 50 minutes because there are other cars on the road. That's lit fiber. Dark fiber is your own lane on the highway 24 hours a day. There is no traffic. Hyperscale tenants in the data center world globally are increasingly insisting on dark fiber, and there isn't enough of it buried in the ground yet. So stage 1 of dark fiber was very much a venture play, where getting municipality by municipality approval to have a construction crew come out and bury cable in the ground. That's a venture exercise. Stage 2 is, I am buying an asset that is 8% utilized and is absolutely critical to the interconnectivity of this massively growing data center space. That's where we stepped into dark fiber, filling the cable with long-term leases from hyperscale tenants. Highly successful investment for us, and it was in Northern Virginia, which is the center of the universe for data centers. Another fun fact that we came up, this is old, but at the time of the investment in dark fiber, no matter where you are in the world, if you're on your iPhone and you open a web page, 76% of global traffic, when you pull that page up, goes through Northern Virginia before it comes back to your phone. Doesn't make any sense. If you're in Malaysia, why should it go through DC? It does. So owning the dark fiber in Northern Virginia is an interesting tailwind, secular move.
Family offices are actually deluged with complicated and unencumbered assets. And I'm curious if you found over the years, if there's a way to train others to diligence these opportunities, what kind of frameworks can you apply? What kind of heuristics can you use? Mostly, I would say, just to filter out the dead ends.
That's a really interesting question. And as I said, we have a number and a growing number of family office investors. Some of them we work very closely with and have brought into a couple of our deals as co-investors. And so there's always a bit of an education process, with the starting point being the valuation metric. That's the biggest challenge. The blessing for family offices is that most of them were created due to growth. And so the first lens of inspection for the next opportunity is, how much is this growing? When we show you wireless spectrum valued on a per megahertz pop basis, it's difficult to digest for a lot of traditional, very successful investors. And so what we've tried to do is to understand, or what we tell people, or when we begin a process and we're bringing others in, we explain our starting point and what we're trying to get to, as opposed to, this is a company that can go from 5 million of EBITDA to 40. This is an asset that is valued on the following basis, and we know we could sell it in 60 days if we wanted to. But if the world behaves in a certain set of ways that we believe is possible, and we have the right operating partner to reposition and work the assets, not just sit on them and collect a royalty stream, we believe we have exposure to the right end tail of equity, and these assets might be valued on a different basis. So Care Bear's purchase valuation metric is very different than the metric upon sale will be, because the asset has morphed and the buyer universe looks at it very differently than our seller. And that happens a lot. So in industrial outdoor storage, when you're negotiating with your aunt who owns the industrial outdoor storage lot that I'm pointing to right now in the middle of Conshohocken, Pennsylvania, that purchase price is based on her experience and sensitivities. When you create a portfolio of 150 of those properties, your valuation metric is different. You've created value by creating the utility. Instead of buying the utility, created the utility. And you're selling to a cap rate buyer, even though you had a cash seller. It's like, I won't take less than my basis is $100,000 from 1979, and someone's offering me $4 million, and I know I made this much last year. Okay, that sounds good to me. The REIT buyer is walking in and saying, this is a 4.7 cap. So there's arbitrage if you understand the different ways that assets can be valued. So when we're talking to family offices, we try to take them out of their comfort zone and out of the growth lens and look at the value lens and the different ways that value can be created other than just flat out growth. Repositioning is not necessarily growth, but repositioning a passenger conversion plane into a wide body cargo plane can instantly create 2.5 times money. You didn't grow it, you just repositioned it. So that's the backdrop for some of our conversations around some of our assets.
How does risk management work within the portfolio? How do you really know how correlated these assets are?
When underwriting, and our underwriting can take, let me find it. We have a deal on our pipeline that has been on the pipeline for 315 days. This is not a sprint. We take the time we need to do our work. The risk management begins on a deal by deal basis during underwriting to identify what correlations exist. And the next sort of portfolio architecture step is we really view our portfolio as a best ideas portfolio. And so investment number 6 is very informed by investments 1 through 5. It can be a great idea, but we need to understand the small correlations that we may have embedded in any individual investment or the first 5 investments taken on as a group. And as you build it out to a 12 or 15 investment portfolio, collectively they behave in a very uncorrelated way. But you have to have an eye to what have I already done? And that can be as simple as an industry statement, and will never be more than 20% in litigation finance or transportation assets or insurance. We'll always have diversification. And so as we move down the path inside any portfolio, we're looking for the next most complementary best idea, not just the next best idea. We've had to pass on some interesting litigation finance things recently because Fund 3, which is currently investing, has enough. So we're seeing some interesting things, but we're not able to act on them. We think the people we've introduced them to will return that favor and benefit Fund 4.
Jeff Collins, thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your wonderful insights.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate the time. Thanks for having me involved.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or share it with your friends. Thank you.